Ordinarily in this space, we'll sit here and we'll give you the latest headlines, things that are happening around the world, whether it be in the Middle East, in the European continent, with the wars and all the places that are fighting, maybe even in the Indo-Pacific. But there are sometimes when we need to actually take advantage of the title of this show, which is the Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and do an analysis and an investigation into really the underpinnings of, especially of the United States, and how we base our decisions about how we use military power, how we use foreign policy, what diplomacy even means to certain people, because that can give you a really good idea about what may happen, and it help explain why we take some of the actions we take. And this is going to be one such episode here today. It's going to look at some of the current events, but with an eye to see why we do what we do and what needs to change as a result of that. We're going to see. But not all the news is bad, because we're also going to show you that some people are looking at this the right way. Last week, there was a debate between former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and former national security advisor in the Trump administration, John Bolton, whom we play here several times, and also Vivek Ramaswamy, former Republican candidate for president and a very, very wealthy businessman. So one of them had the view that they're going to say, hey, we need to use more diplomatic, and by that they mean military power, to accomplish America's objectives around the world. That's John Bolton. And then Vivek Ramaswamy is going to give the alternative view. And the actual question they had was, should the U.S. use diplomatic and military power globally for national security? And really what you're going to see here, and we're going to start with John Bolton, is two very, very different views. Now, John Bolton is going to represent the vast majority of the U.S. national security so-called elite in this country. And it doesn't matter, Republican, Democrat, there's hardly any difference at all. In fact, in many cases, there's no difference. In fact, as you can see, probably the only difference between right now, especially when you're talking about the Middle East, in the policy of Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, is that they're beating each other up to see who is the most pro-Israel and who should go after Iran the most. And we'll understand maybe after watching this why that is in some respects here. But we're going to start off with Ambassador Bolton, because he's going to say in his opening remarks here what he views as a very cogent, actually it is a very cogent article or argument, but he's going to explain how we are so isolationist now, more so than we have been since the 1930s. And the purpose, he says, that is to draw people to focus in on that was before World War II, where we were not ready for that. And he wants to avoid that disastrous so-called outcome. And he said this:
I think it's this real lack of understanding, this ability to talk to the American people, to explain the threats and challenges we face around the world, and what you need to do to protect American interests, that has led to the real manifestation of a problem that's affected us for the past 5 to 10 years, and I think is growing worse. And that is the reemergence in our body politic of isolationism for the first time in a significant way since the 1930s. Now, Washington's farewell address, which you should read in its entirety, was a very carefully thought out legacy that Washington wanted to leave, to tell this new and perilously weak nation to avoid getting involved in European conflicts where we didn't have a real interest. Because he had a longer range vision, which we have now achieved. So everybody remembers the line about avoiding entangling alliances. Let me read one brief passage further on in the farewell address from Washington. He said, "If we remain one people, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyance, when belligerent nations will not lightly hazard the giving us provocation, when we may choose peace or war, as our interest, guided by justice, shall counsel." In other words, Washington understood that the nation had to grow, had to become stronger before it could really exercise its influence internationally.
Okay, very interesting there that he wants to trot out George Washington to validate his expansionist and militaristic type foreign policy, trying to claim that when he said in his farewell address that, we need to avoid international entanglements, it was only until we're strong enough to where we can impose our will on others. That's what he's claiming there. Now, in that segment, he said, you should go and read that, that section there so you can see the context. Well, I took him at his word, and I actually went and did that. Now, as some of you may know, I've actually used that on the show before because it's one of my favorite things in American history because of all the great wisdom that George Washington put in that farewell address in any number of occasions. It's really magnificent prose, and it has absolutely stood the test of time. But what we're going to see here, when you actually do take his advice and go look, and I'm guessing that he really thought people wouldn't do that, what you're going to find out was that John Bolton omitted a few passages within the context of what he said, and he stopped short of reading the rest of it in context that comes to an almost opposite conclusion. For example, so he started reading down here. His version that he read starts with, "Hence it must therefore be wise." No, I'm sorry. He started it right here where he said, "If we remain one people in efficient government." But let's back up just a few sentences above that, where George Washington writes this: "Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none or very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enmities. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course. If we remain one people under an efficient government, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyance." That's what Bolton read. This is what he left out. "When we may take such an attitude, this will cause the neutrality we may at any time resolve upon to be scrupulously respected." And then Bolton continued on, "When belligerent nations, under the impossibility of making acquisition upon us, will not lightly hazard the giving us provocation, when we may choose peace or war as our interest guided by justice shall counsel." That's where Bolton stopped. But if you read the very next sentence, why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand on foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. And then it goes on to say a lot of the parts that are so well known about avoiding entanglements. So it's kind of interesting that Bolton said that what he read followed that part about foreign entanglements, when you just saw with your own eyes, it preceded it to put it in context. So you see that Bolton was essentially completely perverting what George Washington said and trying to twist around his words to mean something that he wants, when it's self-evident when you look at the context. When you do a deep dive on the document, you can see that, in fact, he's saying, don't do that. Don't engage ourselves in the affairs of other people. Well, he was specifically talking about Europe, but obviously the concept is anyone around the world. Why involve yourself with their issues, something that is involved with them that is their arguments and things that happen? Obviously, we saw World War I and World War II followed that, the 30 Years' War, etc., all kinds of stuff. So George Washington was right and absolutely knew what he was talking about there. And in the modern time, that document has stood the test of time because that informs us of what's going on in Europe. The Russia and the Ukraine war, that is an issue between those two. It is not in the United States' interest. Our interests are not threatened by that. We can help. We can be, especially trying to help reach a diplomatic solution. We can certainly do all kinds of things to help people in those regards, which we had the opportunity to do diplomatically in ways that could have prevented this war. Absolutely, 100% certainly that diplomatic efforts are before that war started. And we'll go all the way back to June of 2021, almost a year before the war, again in December 2021. And we talked about this a lot of times, even after the war started. There was all kinds of diplomatic off-ramps, none of which we took. And these are all issues between Russia and Ukraine. Russia doesn't want Ukraine to have a NATO alliance of the entirety of Western Europe on its front door. That was the issue that was placed. And then within the country, they had a civil war since 2014, where the eastern part, the Russian speakers, felt like that they were being exploited by the western part, the Ukrainian speakers. And so they had been fighting an 8-year civil war prior to that. That's internal disputes between the two parts of within the one country and then the countries on the border with each other. There's no reason why we should have gotten involved with that. And now that we're standing on the precipice of possibly this war escalating, and which could draw us in a worst case scenario, which is not too far afield, could end up in nuclear exchange. That's not in America's interest. Okay, so just understand that's what Bolton means. That's what he wants. His vision of things is that that's where we should go. But then let's look at some of the other issues here, because one of the things Bolton says that he knew that we had to get stronger, that George Washington knew that we had to get stronger so that we could impose our will on others. George Washington never said anything implied in that entire document or anywhere in his writings that we should get strong so that we can impose our will on others. To the contrary, they continued to say, and ironically, Bolton later in his comments there, and by the way, the entire thing is the clip, the link is in the description below. So go and visit it, watch the whole thing. It's like an hour and 20 minutes or something. So you can see the whole thing in context. But he cited something that Thomas Jefferson had done about not wanting to just be passive and allow people to views our interest on the seas. And he said, I'd rather spend a lot of money on deterrence than pay tribute to pirates in the area or whatever. That is directly our national security interest. And so it's reasonable that that's what you would want to do. That's why we have an armed forces. That's why we don't just have a State Department. We have a Department of Defense so that we can defend. That's why it is so vital that you have to have a strong military and a stronger national or diplomacy, State Department. Because if you have those things, then you won't get yourself involved in wars that aren't yours, and you will be strong enough to defend yourself should you be attacked. That should be what you go after, but it's not what Bolton and his kind go after. Now that I want to shift the case here and look at Vivek Ramaswamy's opening statement. Now, he's going to start off with the notion that we should not be the world's policeman, that we should not primarily lead with military force to get our way around the world. Watch what he said.
As the resolution is drafted, it's very hard to disagree on the face of it that the U.S. should use diplomatic power and military might to advance America's interests. That's hard to disagree with, and I wouldn't do that. But I think the essence of what's at stake is whether or not the United States, and the way I read it, actually at its core meaning, is whether or not the United States has a role to play as a global policeman. And the answer to that question for me is an absolute no. I have no doubt that the people in the audience here are ready to make the ultimate sacrifice for the country, should our country require it. That's why I respect all of you who are here for what you do. That being said, we cannot in good conscience send America's sons and daughters to go die in a war if we haven't identified what the objective of that war really is. And the reason I'm against the resolution as I see it, which is whether or not the United States should be the world's global policeman, is the evidence suggests that we have failed miserably. For that $8 trillion, for those 7,000 lives, for the 53,000 injuries, for the 30,000 more suicides.
Now, what he was talking about there was he was given basically a line item, a box score, if you will, for the disastrous wars that we'd fought in the previous 20 years and how none of them had achieved positive outcomes for the United States. And one of the big reasons that he correctly identifies is because we set no attainable military objectives. We have fought in Iraq. We have fought in Afghanistan. We fought in Libya. And in every case, what was the result of that? Iraq is more Iran today and governed by Iran than ever it was in the decades prior to our involvement there. And it still is relatively unstable, even though we have troops on the ground there. Of course, Afghanistan, we went in there to unseat the Taliban, and 20 years later, the Taliban is back in control. Just humiliating defeat. The way we got out was bad, etc. We should have gotten out a long, long time ago and avoided defeat altogether. But because we weren't willing to do anything that made sense, we just kept on going with the fiction that, no, this is an outcome I desire, and I'm just going to just keep going until I get it, until finally you had to acknowledge you're not going to get it. Libya, we supported an aerial campaign with a number of other Western nations to unseat Muammar Gaddafi because we didn't like him. We thought he was a bad actor, and the outcome has been absolute disaster for the country of Libya. There are now two governments competing that both say they're the legitimate government, and it's just disaster. There's been nothing but war ever since then. So any way you want to look at it, and especially to the U.S., he talks about our losses in direct losses in personnel, $6 to $8 trillion, depending on who does the calculating, in future and our current and future outlay of cost that are like baked in for what we're going to have to pay. There's also the wounded in action. He talked about the suicides that he talked about that have been 35,000 or so in that same period of time among our armed forces. And he didn't even talk about the traumatic brain injuries and the PTSD that we've suffered, and that is in the hundreds of thousands. So there has been a profound impact on our American citizens. And then that doesn't even talk about the consequences to the regions where these wars took place, and the hundreds of thousands of people who died and who were put to flee, etc. So any way you want to cut it, any way you want to look at it, this policy that Bolton is arguing for has been a complete and utter disaster, and it has not only not improved America, it has cost us tremendously in every way you want to look at it. The other thing that he was talking about there is that, pardon me, the absence of any militarily attainable objective. It was absolutely fatal. In Iraq, we went in there, we unseated Saddam Hussein, and then what? Democracy is going to come to the Middle East. We literally were just sitting around there for about a year trying to figure out what to do, and then the insurgency started because they didn't want to be occupied. And we saw how that worked out. Nothing good ever came out of it from the United States. And to this day, the Iranian militias, the Iranian-backed militias, are part of the Iraqi security force. Not that they're uninvited, but they're actually on the payroll. And we know, of course, that many of the leaders of Iraq are heavily influenced by Iran. So if you wanted to make things better for the United States or Iraq, we didn't do that. And obviously in Afghanistan, we set completely unrealistic, unattainable military objectives, in that it basically, Bush in the late part turned it into a nation building operation. Obama doubled down on the nation building. And the problem is those aren't military tasks. So you send your military in there to accomplish political objectives, and they aren't designed to do that. And there's no pathway to do it. So that is this idea that you can send the military to shape events around the world. All you're going to do is trying to use like a hammer and like a pair of pliers to do brain surgery. That's not the right tools. And you can't accomplish that objective no matter how skilled the person is with them in hand. If that's the tools you got, that's not how you fix a problem in someone's brain. If you're doing brain surgery, you got to have very highly skilled person and tools. Ergo, diplomatic tools in this case. We could have accomplished so many things diplomatically if we had only been willing to say, look, everybody has their interest around the world. If you don't directly threaten the United States, we can try and accommodate everywhere we can. Let's look for a win-win situation. Win-win doesn't exist in the John Bolton and neocon world. It doesn't, folks. It's our way or the military tool. It's either our way or we're going to bring the barrel of a gun to your face. How effective has that been? It's alluring to be able to say that. You know, Lindsey Graham is a huge proponent of this, but it is absolutely and utterly failure and disastrous for our country so far. Now, in all the such situations I mentioned with Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, etc., Syria, you can add that to the list of complete failures, disastrous policies that both the Obama and the Trump administration and the Biden administration, all of them have been going towards and following, that has no positive benefit for the United States, definitely no positive benefits for the recipient countries, and we're in a worse position than we were before. Now then, this situation with Russia and Ukraine, because we're still following that same blind path, could lead us into a war. The situation in the Middle East, because we are blindly saying we want this outcome, even though there is no military solution there. that Israel is pursuing. There's no pathway to military victory, yet we're just blindly handing over whatever Israel asks in terms of arms and ammunition. It's not going to help Israel. It's not going to help the United States. It may get us sucked into a war. Already you have the Houthis, you have the of course the Hamas, but the Hezbollah. You've got these militia groups in Iraq, in Syria, Jordan, etc. Many of them have been fighting us, none of which were fighting us prior to Israel going into the Gaza Strip in relation to what happened on October 7th of last year. That could have been solved diplomatically. That could have been handled diplomatically in so many different ways. I won't go through all those right now, but the military path that we're taking can't succeed. There's no path to doing that, and yet we stay on it. Next, I want to go to real quick, Bolton then talking about the growing problem of the alliance between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And the interesting thing, in his view, this is all their fault. We didn't do anything.
The dominant presence in the world today is a growing China-Russia axis with its outriders like North Korea, Iran, Syria, Belarus, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. This axis has nothing to do with the United States. This axis has been forming for 15 years, despite multiple efforts by the United States to bring Russia to the West unsuccessfully. The fact is that the unwillingness to confront the threats that we've seen effectively that led to repeated Russian aggression in Ukraine and the threat that China now poses along its Indo-Pacific periphery is a clear product of this moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union when the United States took its eye off the ball.
So the whole thing is because we, quote, took our eye off the ball after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like everything was going fine up until that point, but then we took our eye off the ball, and then because we're passive and we didn't do anything, that all these nations now like that, they were all just waiting to come after the United States and, you know, clear of us taking our eye off the ball. They all rose, and now we're paying the price for that. That's the vision. That's the image that John Bolton top and all these neocon folks at the core, that's what they preach. But there is no truth to that whatsoever. I mean, you have to be honest, and every nation has its own interest and its own desires. And there is no doubt that China wants to be a regional power. There's no doubt that Russia wants to recover from the losses that it suffered at the end of the Cold War. There's no question about that. But there should also be no surprise about that. Every nation wants to rise and influence its borders, get security, and influence things around it. The bigger the nation, the more powerful, the more they want to do it. Kind of like us. That's our view. There's no problem with that per se. The problem comes in when you say only we can have that. And so when he talks about the rise of all these other centers of power and then talks about how it comes out of nowhere, you got to look at that in context and be honest, at least, because we have basically an entire ring of bases in the Indo-Pacific around China. We've been engaging in all kinds of coercive sanctions against them. We have trading practices that we try to put tariffs on a lot of their products to compel them to do other things here. And we keep talking about building up military forces in the Indo-Pacific, claiming that China is going to be ready to go to war soon. And many are saying, let's get rid of strategic ambiguity over Taiwan and let's directly say that we'll fight China over that situation there. That is what they see. We send these so-called freedom of navigation operations where we send American warships through the Taiwan Straits very close to the Chinese border. We send all kinds of reconnaissance flights routinely around their border. We sail in their seas. We fly in the airspace next to their country on a regular basis. Now, what reaction do you think that's going to have? Well, just look at us. We just went really crazy. Lots of people were making all kinds of alarming comments because Russia and China were patrolling near the Aleutian Islands not long ago. And there are a lot of alarm with that, or that China may put a base in somewhere in Africa, while we have a whole slew of them all over the place near China's borders. What do you think that's going to do? Do you think that they're going to, well, I know what they want. They want that China's just going to back down and just going to say, I'm sorry. Okay, y'all do whatever you want to do, and we won't do anything in response. That's not human nature. Anyone with power is not going to just submit to a different power. They're going to counter it. So if you want them to take action here, then you need to start doing what you can to not give them any motivation to it and try to find a win-win solution. That's why diplomacy is the more powerful form, because it can accomplish at a much lower cost your national security and your economic prosperity. That's where we should be going, instead of going in these areas that have the opposite effect. It costs us economically, and it puts our national security at even greater risk without any benefit. And then, of course, we can go the Israeli-Iran war and all that stuff. All we've done is support Israel against all these enemies with no strings attached. Nobody else has a chance to win anything. And I wonder why there's all this chaos in the Middle East. You have the historical issues which have been going on for decades and centuries, so it's already going to be unstable. And then we're just pouring gasoline on it because we're not even attempting any more diplomacy. There was a time in the past where we did, and we gave it our best good faith efforts. Now those days are over, and we're only leading with military power like John Bolton wants. And then, of course, I've already mentioned stuff about the Russia-Ukraine war. We're supplying Ukraine every weapon in the world. We got a 50-nation alliance to give them weapons to kill Russians, and we wonder why Russia doesn't like us. We wonder why Russia is upset. I mean, we would be if the situation happened in reverse, because, again, it's human nature and it's irrational and illogical to think that we can take these actions and there won't be counteractions. That's one of the key things about the Bolton view of things, is that they think that there's never going to be counteractions, that there should only be our actions and then subservience on the other side. Doesn't work that way. All right, sorry, I'm running out of time here. So let me show you this last little clip here, because it's really instructive between Bolton and Ramaswamy, and you're going to see how Ramaswamy exposes the real core failure of the Bolton mentality. Watch this.
My question would be, how do we advance American interests today? And I believe that involves peace in Ukraine as quickly as we can get there on reasonable terms, while weakening the Russia-China alliance and getting the Russian military presence out of the West. And my question for Ambassador Bolton, with due respect, is, because I think it's an important and relevant conversation, how do you define success in this Ukraine war? What is the war objective, and how do you define success? Be specific.
Yes,
Getting Putin to move is not specific. Specifically.
I can state it very simply. It's the declared position of every member of NATO right now, the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, let me ask you a question.
Well, let me just respond.
Let Ambassador Bolton.
Come on now. Well, this is not a
one for one.
debate. Not a campaign debate.
I'll let you.
Does that mean actually the pre-war lines? The pre-war lines.
I answered your question. Now you
didn't answer if it was the pre-war lines.
1-1, gentlemen.
Yeah. My question is, Senator J.D. Vance has laid out what he thinks a peace deal for Ukraine should look like: a ceasefire in place, Russia keeps the territory it holds, demilitarized zone between the two. He omits the fact there's a different border between Russia and Ukraine, but demilitarized zone. And Ukraine agrees not to join NATO. Do you agree with that?
Well, I'm going to first require an understanding of what your answer was to my question to be able to respond to it. And I think the question is, we can actually disagree about what the objective is or whether we should pursue that objective, but we should understand what the objective actually is. So as I understand your response, but I want to make sure I properly understand it before engaging, your view is that it has to be the pre-war boundaries that have to be restored to Ukraine. That is the war objective that we're solving for. That's what I take as my understanding of your question.
That is my position and the present position of the entire NATO alliance.
And again, just descriptive here, not sort of drawing an argument, but just to get the viewpoints on the table. So is Crimea then part of Russia, or is it part of Ukraine?
It's part of Ukraine, as the Russian Federation agreed at the Belavasia Agreement in 1992.
So I think that's at least constructive, because we are able to have a discussion where we know what we're disagreeing on. I think it is absolutely not only unrealistic, it is unfathomable that from these conditions, we're going to get to a place where somehow, by waving a magic wand, Crimea is going to be returned to Ukraine, Zaporizhia, talking about all of the other parts that are occupied today. That's just not going to happen. It is lunacy.
It is lunacy, and it's irrational. There is no rational path that anyone can make, John Bolton or anyone else, that you're going to unseat Russia and move them out, because Russia has, the extraordinarily and irreversible strength in the air defense, manpower by the millions, their industrial capacity far outstripping anything that the West can do in its cumulative, even with its 50 nations and all this stuff. There is no way you can reverse the losses that Ukraine has in the foreseeable future. There's no path. So if you're predicating a policy based on the unattainable, that you're guaranteeing that you are going to fail. We failed in Afghanistan because we did that, but that was on a peripheral issue. This is on a core issue with a nuclear power. And that there is the real core issue, is that if you don't pursue diplomacy and you don't even have the possibility of a win-win, if you don't follow George Washington's advice to avoid international entanglements that don't have anything to do with your power and your interest, then you're not going to be able to pursue your interest anywhere, because you're going to be sucked in and possibly drawn into a war you should never fight and may not be able to win. In a worst case scenario, it goes into nuclear weapons and everyone will lose. That fact alone should absolutely guide any rational thinking person that wants to benefit themselves to say, all right, we're going to avoid going down this path because there is no victory. There's no success even possible. Let's go here where there are successes possible. And giving the chaotic dynamics and the competing interests, we have a pretty good reason to think we can succeed here. That's what rational thinking people should do. That's what America has done at times in the past, and we are absolutely not doing right now. That is the core issue that's at stake here, and why the people like Bolton are so dangerous for our own national security. And even though they claim it's to make us stronger, they're demonstrably making us weaker. And I pray to God we never find out how bad this could get if we keep following that advice. We have to hope that Ramaswamy is able to use some of his leverage to actually start bringing more of this into light, which is why we're expounding on this today and giving some airtime to it, so that more people can know that there is another path, that it's very rational, that can be successful. Thank you very much for watching today, folks. Listen, we got a great one coming up to you here in just a little while. The amazing George Galloway is going to be on our show today. You are not going to want to miss this. 1 p.m. Eastern Time in Washington, D.C. It's going to be great. We'll see you shortly on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.